Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 466, featuring Tom Grimes, who is, of course, our product manager for Chaos Corona. I've known Tom. Of course, I work with Tom every day. I've known him for a while. He's a fantastic person. I can't believe he's actually hasn't been on the podcast. But, it was great to have him on and to talk about, obviously, Corona and the impact that Corona has and how it's different from our other products at Chaos. And just talking about rendering in general, the philosophy behind Corona. And how it differentiates itself from V-Ray. Obviously, if you guys remember, we actually did a podcast a long time ago with the original founders of Corona and talked about a little bit how they were inspired by V-Ray when they created Corona and how they followed a certain path. And they sort of talk about that with Tom as well. Talk about how the path is different, what philosophically it's different, and the way that it approaches rendering, which is really, really cool. And then, of course, how it fits into the ecosystem. But also just great to talk to Tom, who's a really nice guy, and I love hanging out with him. So, and I'm sure you will too for the next hour. So thanks, Tom, so much for coming on and talking to us, enlightening us more about what's going on over in the world of Corona. Okay, I do have a couple of announcements. Again, I brought this up a few times, but V-Ray 6 Update 2 for Maya and Houdini is out. A lot of big updates have been going on there, but we do have a lot of stuff also happening with Material X. That's our big Material X update. And if you guys are interested in Material X, you should definitely check it out. I should note that in a few weeks from now, we actually will have a full episode with those product managers for those products, and we'll give you a big breakdown on what's going on there, and specifically learn more about Material X and why it's so important and how we're working with it in that way. So really cool to do that. Another announcement I have is actually we have a special deal right now on V-Ray. If you want to get a yearly license of V-Ray, you get 3 extra months, and that's a great offer. You can just go to chaos.com for this, and that offer ends on March 29th. So if you want to get that 3 extra months, go ahead and sign up. Just go again to chaos.com, and that's where you can do that. A few other announcements we have is there's an event happening actually right now as of this podcast coming out. So it's in San Jose between March 17th and the 20th, so it's already happening as we speak. But Vlado should be in San Jose, and if you guys want to meet up, you should definitely do that. It'd be good for you guys to sync with him. We also, other things I want to mention as well, is we're going to have some, I mentioned at the end of last year that Nikos is doing a bunch of workshops on creative lighting. And if you'd like to be part of that or learn part of that, that would be great. Just one in Berlin on March 20th and one in Toronto on April 3rd. So for any of those, just go to chaos.com/events and sign up and look up all that information for all the events coming up, including several more that I haven't had time to talk about just yet. But if you guys want to know more about the podcast, you guys know where to go. You just go to chaos.com/CG Garage. That's where all of our podcasts are posted. And if you want to follow us on Facebook, it is facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast. And if you want to watch any of these podcasts, you can, of course, go to youtube.com/Chaos Group TV, where we post all our videos, including the podcast. If you have suggestions of guests you'd like to have on the podcast, we always welcome them. In fact, we've been getting a lot of great suggestions, which we definitely have had on this podcast as well. And the suggestions are labs@chaos.com. Again, labs@chaos.com is where you can email us with all of your suggestions or even just general feedback. We would love to hear from you as well. All right. But for now, please enjoy my good friend, Tom Grimes.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passé. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
All right. So, Tom, thanks for joining us. Finally, it's been interesting. I've known you, obviously, for many years and worked with you for a long time. And it's probably been a long time coming that we should have done this podcast. But let's start with that. Let's start with a little intro in terms of like how did you get into doing the things that you do? Like, what got you into doing CG? What got you passionate about this stuff? Where did all this originate from?
Well, I've had I don't even call it a career. Career always sounds like a canal. You build it from A to B and you march along in a straight line, then from B to C. And I don't think anybody's life ever works like that. It's actually like a meandering river. You're kind of generally heading towards the sea, but you're taking all these detours and roundabout ways. But if I focus it on the 3D, I think my first exposure was the early Pixar's, the Luxor Junior, Red's Dream. They were on late night on Channel 4 back in the UK.
Uh-huh.
And I thought it was amazing, but I never really considered it as a career because I thought you needed to be a rocket scientist with all this mathematical knowledge. And that was probably true. It wasn't very accessible back in the early days.
Right.
But then I can attribute the 3D side of my career to playing Half-Life.
Really?
Of all things. Yes. Played Half-Life and then discovered it had a level editor. And I was like, ooh, I can actually mess around with something that's 3D.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't make levels. I tried to recreate a black and white photo of an old church. And when I thought, oh, okay, I've done pretty good within the limitations of a level editor. Let's have a look for software. And this is back in the days of the free cover disc. Not everybody will remember those, but there was a free cover disc with True Space on it. And I learned that. It was 3D World magazine, I believe. So I learned that. And I thought, oh, I'm good enough at this. I could buy it. And it was always on sale. And it was probably the most affordable 3D program out there. So that's how I got started. And because I was in the community and sent into the gallery every month, eventually they advertised for a marketing role. And I was like, I've never done marketing, but I'm part of the community. They know my name. I know how to talk to developers because I was actually an analyst programmer at Rolls-Royce for a while. On IBM mainframes, people these days, what's a mainframe? What's a free CD cover disc? All these strange words. So I thought, I'll take the opportunity. I'll apply. What the heck? Worst that can happen is they say no. But they said yes. And anyway, that's how I got started in 3D, which of course has led to where we are now.
Okay. All right. So you have this way about things. So how did you get connected with the guys, making Corona?
It was actually remarkably similar. I was freelancing in 3D by this point in time. Microsoft bought out Caligari. They really only wanted the developers. So after a year, marketing and everybody, all the extraneous part of the company, we were called in. There's a phone call with Steve Ballmer, and you're thinking, this can't be good news, really. Group phone call. So I've had the privilege of being fired by Steve Ballmer. They let everybody else go, apart from the dev. So they moved on to various other projects. So I'd gone back to freelancing in 3D, and because I was working with other people, I was forced to use 3ds Max. I'll say that at the time. I was a Modo user previously.
Oh, Modo. Okay.
And had to use 3ds Max so I could collaborate with other team members. And didn't like, Mental Rain, all the inbuilt engines. So I'd tried everything that was out there at the time. This was back in, 2012 or so, and picked Corona. And then in a similar fashion, having used it for, 6 months or a year, Render Legion, as it was back then, advertised for somebody in marketing. And I was like, oh, pick me, because I'd done it for Caligari, and I could also say the same thing. I used to be a developer. I can talk to developers, I can talk to users, I can be that bridge in between the two. So it was in 2017 I started work for them. And then, of course, 2016, then we merged in 2017, became part of Chaos. And I stayed there in marketing until May last year. And I shifted from product marketing manager to product manager now for Corona.
Wow. Okay. All right. So what does that entail?
Oh, you're basically trying to pick looking ahead, what will people want 6 months, a year, 2 years time from Corona? Um, and a lot of what we do is focus on what our users tell us, of course. It's how Corona was started, very much formed. We had Adam.
Yeah, actually, tell us the story. Like, tell us the history of Corona a little bit, because I mean, we had the guys on before to talk about their involvement. But from your perspective, I'd like to sort of a refresher on the history of Corona and how that all started.
So we had Andre, who had started developing a render engine, just because, really. And then he had a connection with Yaroslav at the university. And then Adam came on board from, he was working at Vantage in London, I believe, at the time. So he came on board. He had lots of archviz experience and lots of connections to the archviz industry in London. And he was saying, what we really need is a specialist archviz render engine. V-Ray is great, but it's a general render engine that has to do everything anybody could possibly ever want, which makes it more complicated. Whereas an archviz artist only needs a subset of that feature set, and they would prefer a different way of presenting it in the UI. Everything can be streamlined so that you streamline your workflow. And that was the three that founded it. Between Adam, Andre, and Yaroslav, they brought all this together and began to shape what Corona was. Adam brought in Peter Guthrie, Henry Goss from the Boundary. We had the Recent Spaces people. We had all these Asymmetrica. They're all still with us today, but they were all on board when we were an alpha free version. Was before my time, but I've become familiar with the history since. And yeah, so basically they told us what they wanted to see, how it should work, what they needed, what they didn't need. And this is how Corona has been shaped from the ground up to be for archviz. And like I say, those people are still with us. They're still users, and they're still telling us what they want to see, and we're still doing our best to listen.
Well, that's interesting. So let's actually dive into a little bit deeper. What is it that makes a renderer more centered around archviz compared to to VFX or a more general purpose renderer?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we don't do. A lot of stuff that V-Ray does is because of the very complex and demanding workflows for VFX studios, where you need to have all these different layers and you're compositing things together. You need to be able to control the sampling of an individual light, because maybe you're trying to squeeze that last 5 seconds off your render time. Whereas for archviz, they're more concerned with, I want to just set stuff up and it works, and when I hit render, it looks realistic. They're less concerned about flexibility afterward. They're less concerned, interestingly, with speed. They're more interested in quality. And so tweaking individual lights to maybe optimize a little bit of time, they don't want to spend time doing that.
Right.
They want to be as much like a photographer. This is how they've always described it to us. Imagine the building is there and we're walking through it. And what we want to do is be picking the best shots with the camera and taking a photograph. So that's how they want it to act. It's how they want to be a virtual photographer rather than a 3D artist as such. They don't want to be a specialist in the software. They want to focus on composition and lighting and the angle that they're taking the photo from.
Well, honestly speaking, I feel like that's a little bit, in some ways, a lot that visual effects people want too. Right? But I think that there's something, or at least they say they do, right? That's one of the problems. They say they want simplicity, but really it's like simplicity as long as I have all of these things, right?
Right. And I think V-Ray has come a long way since Corona was invented.
Sure.
V-Ray has simplified its UI on the top. Which I think is to the good. But everything all that control is still there underneath. And I liken it to Corona's like old-time television. You can watch whatever was on, and you go through it in steps. And V-Ray's like a streaming service. you go into the streaming service planning to watch show A, but you know show B and C and D are there, and you just get tempted to go and have a look, and it's the same. So you go in aiming to do your render, but you know if you just tweak this light, maybe I can save 10 seconds off my render. And the temptation is there to dive into that deeper level. You don't get such a temptation in Corona because you can't do it.
Right.
Yeah. So we try and make sure they can do everything they want to do, but nothing that they don't want, so it doesn't get in the way of the UI and the workflow.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there's always been sort of this interesting thing between Corona and V-Ray. And obviously before the merger, there was like, which one are you using? Are you using V-Ray or Corona, right? And so that...
And it's funny because I think people had the impression that the teams hated each other, or they wanted to wipe the other one out, and it was never true. Vlado and Andre were always
mutual
great
respect.
Friends. Yeah, and the same. I think any sort of competition was mostly in the eyes of the user base, but from our side as a company, I mean, we got along great.
100%, 100%.
Yeah.
You should see Marcos Fajaro from Vented Arnold and Vlado. They get along great. They're good, and they talk all the time, and they have so much respect for each other. And it's most of the Arnold or V-Ray is better conversation is totally on the user side, right? And totally on the this thing is like, I have all the answers. Like, but there's so much respect for the actual code, because fundamentally it's a love of ray tracing and a love of rendering that's all about, right?
Exactly. And that's really what drives us. And it drives everybody at Chaos. This is the thing I've noticed about the company to work at. Everybody is in love with the product, the technology, and our users, and what the users create. And I think that's why we come into work every day. Some companies you work for, some jobs you come in for the salary, and you're just doing it. We come in because we're passionate.
Oh yeah.
And you need a salary because you need to have a roof over your head and have something to eat, but it's not the prime factor. What really drives us to wake up in the morning, I think, is the passion we have for what we create.
Yeah, 100%. I think this is something that's very much about the drive that we do, and also the inspiration, right? There's a lot of inspiration that happens in visual effects and in archviz. They're like, I'm inspired by this thing or something that's really beautiful, and I want to make something beautiful. And it's you seeing the work that other people are doing, and sort of aspire to see what can I do that's also in that level. How do you guys engage? What's been obviously as on your role, there's been a lot of drive towards engagement with the community and engagement in terms of how you talk to them and how you communicate with them and how you help promote them and how you put them on top. How does that sort of engagement work for you guys?
Yeah,
specifically on the Corona community, because it's all part of Chaos, but there's a Corona community that's very strong as well, obviously.
Yes, I mean, I've always loved talking with users, and personally speaking, the thing that excites me most is what we do helps them realize their dreams. Whether they're in archviz or VFX, whatever they're doing, they're creating something that they love doing, and we are enabling that for them. So I've always loved talking with our users. On top of anything else that I do in my role. So even to this day, I still troll through all the forums, and I still go through the main Facebook posts. Of course, I love getting to in-person events. That's the best when you can chat with them over a beer or a cup of coffee, depending on the event. And that's always been my favorite. And that technically in the job description, going to the forums, not really what you're there for, but I can't help it.
Sure.
I like to know what are they struggling with, what are they asking for, what are they creating, and if I can help, I'll jump in and help. And we have a support team who will help. But I just think it's good that they know I'm there and I care. I'm not some detached person in an ivory tower, far removed from the day-to-day of their work and their efforts. I'm right there still in the community with them. I've always felt that's important. You can tie it into sales and marketing and it's good. But at the end of the day, I love it. And I do think the users love it too. And so therefore, I'm always going to keep doing it no matter what.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, just similar to what you were saying, I've actually become very close friends with a lot of our users, right? And, Ian Spriggs and I are very close. I just got an email, for example, from Pedro Conti, who does a huge amount of amazing animation and commercials. And he emailed me excited. It's like, I just created something new. I really would love to share it with you guys. And I was like, that's amazing. And so that excitement of like wanting to be part of that community and working with everyone is kind of special. So obviously, there's been a lot of discussion. I remember in the early days, the merger between our companies happened, and there was a lot of concerns like, oh, well, how is Corona doing? Is Chaos going to kill Corona? And or the merger. There was a lot of obviously people that felt. Well, not a lot. There were several people that felt that there was concern about the merger, but then there was a lot of people who were like, well, we'll wait and see. There's no reason not to do that. Obviously, many years have passed, and so a lot of that has sort of been mitigated. What are your thoughts about the idea that we have these two renderers that have a lot of similarities, except they're slightly different focused, and how has the community sort of reacted over the years to that process?
I will say it's hilarious. It's 7 years.
7 years, right?
2017 it happened, and whenever anything happens that somebody doesn't like, there's a feature we don't introduce into Corona or whatever. Somebody will always comment, "It's that merger! I knew this would happen." It's like it's been 7 years. Really? I mean, you're still bringing it up as a topic,
right?
So anyway, I find that amusing. There was a lot of concern. Valid, I think, when you look at the pattern of how things had gone in other companies. Now, it was a merger and not an acquisition. It was both companies came together and decided to do this. And of course, I was slightly nervous because, like I say, Microsoft had bought Caligari. That was an acquisition. And then a year later, I was out of a job. The product was discontinued. So I wasn't immune. I totally understood where they were coming from.
Sure.
But I also totally understood this was very different. That Vlado and Andra had sat together and discussed it, and then it had gone to the wider scheme of things in the company, and everything was set for Corona to keep going strong. There was no plan to cannibalize it or kill one or the other. And as to why we still have both, it ultimately comes down to when you approach a user, and it's what we've kind of discussed a bit before. Some of them will prefer Corona, and some of them will prefer Vive to a massive extent. Not just like, I can use both, but I think this one is slightly better. I always describe it as like the products of a philosophy. This is how I felt when I was choosing between Corona and Vive. I don't even remember what else was on the market back then. And it was just something when I opened the program, it made sense to me. The way things were described, the workflow, the UI, I was like, I understand this. This shares the same philosophy, the same mindset that I do as an artist. And when I opened Vive, I was just like, it's kind of like me opening Blender. I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I was kind of lost. Did I lose connection?
No, you're still here.
Oh, yeah, okay, you're back. Yeah, I was kind of lost in Vive, and I just preferred Corona, and to very strongly. And I still see the same thing from the users today. And we can talk about it in terms of the archviz specialization and the quality of the light people seem to love out of Corona rendering, and how the defaults satisfy your needs in 90% of cases. And that's the technical side, but ultimately it comes down to, I think, people just connect to it. Each one has a personality, a philosophy, and people feel it when they use it, and they know which one is right for them. The other one really wouldn't be a good fit. We'd be forcing a square peg into a round hole, and we don't want to do that. So getting rid of one or the other doesn't really make sense, because there's a pretty passionate group on either side for whom it's the only fit. It's the right shoe,
right,
and they don't want to be wearing the different one.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to get a little bit into this probably could be triggering for people, or maybe they'll enjoy being triggered about this. But there is something very different not very different. There is something interesting about Corona to me, just from an outside perspective. I've only peripherally used it or touched on it because I've been using V-Ray for so long. Just like you said, it's like I've been using this for so long. It's just familiar for me to use that. But there's something interesting about if you from an outside perspective, looking at Corona stuff in terms of what I see readily available. It is almost, it has solved, not solved, but it does something that is one of the most critical things in architecture visualization, and that is it just nails global illumination. Better than it's all possible to do it in any other solution, right? Everyone can do that level of global illumination, but almost every image I see that's done with Corona it's just not even a question, right? It almost makes it impossible for you not to nail it, right? So what is it about that? Is it the fact that it just has good defaults that makes it very hard for you not to do that?
I'd say so. Because ultimately, when you get to the mathematics underneath it, the algorithm is the algorithm, really, no matter which software you use. So it can't be that. But we have been told repeatedly by Corona users something about the lighting, and it does just come out that way straight away with no effort. But there's just something about the lighting that they love, and we've heard that on interviews with various big names, not just new users. And I can only put it down to the fact that we do have this focus on good defaults. We don't focus on speed; we focus on quality. We kind of assume you're going to be willing to wait that little bit longer because you get the kind of image that's going to wow your client. You're working for a client who's going to sell an apartment that costs 18 million. So that's what your images are ultimately for. Those can't be second rate or it's pretty good.
Right.
That has to nail everything if you're selling stuff at that level. And so, does it take a little bit longer? Fine, because we get the quality that we need to serve the needs of our clients. And that's our user's perspective. And I do believe it really must just come down to the defaults. And we do, that's our aim. We try and make it very hard. You have to break Corona to make a bad render. You have to do something really strange and go out of your way to make it look terrible. And if that's true, we've done our job.
It's true. I think people forget about the fact that they're creating images, an architectural visualization specifically, not beyond actual architecture design and other things like that. Architecture visualization are creating images that are specifically supposed to move and motivate you enough to spend $18 million on a very expensive apartment in Dubai or something, right?
Exactly.
And that is a lot of money. If you think about it, even from the entertainment perspective, right? Movies that cost $100 million or need to make $100 million, we're talking about 4 images coming from a very talented artist that's got to nail something before it's built so that person is willing to spend that amount of money on that construction.
Exactly. And this applies across the board. We have, our big studios, but we make Corona so that even if you're a small freelancer, even if you're new to archviz, your images should be coming up to that quality without you having to think too much about it. So it kind of gives everybody an even playing field, whether you're starting out or whether you're an old hand, whether you're doing a $200,000 apartment or an $18 million apartment, you have access to the same kind of fidelity that you need. And that's our aim. And I think we achieve it well. And I think that's why people pick it over V-Ray. You can get there in V-Ray, I have no doubt. But I think you may have to work a little bit harder. And who wants to do that? Who wants to work harder if you can help it, right?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of work, obviously, to do that, and it's a lot of pressure from our users. But this is something you have brought up several times, and I've actually over the years have brought it up as well. Is that defaults are good, right? And that is actually the work.
Yes.
majority of the work that we're doing on the sort of a high end of our rendering solutions is to make defaults that are highly functional and efficient. And for your case, you're making them with a specific philosophy of good quality global illumination, good quality renders, at possibly the sacrifice of not necessarily the most optimal speed. You could probably get it slightly faster for other reasons, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And then at Chaos' side, obviously, we very much make sure that the quality is good, but at the same time, we also don't want people, like in terms of V-Ray, in terms of people doing something that is going to slow them down, right? Or going to create a problem. So our defaults are built like this is going to give you the most optimal raycasting solution that you want, right? And so that works, which I always thought is like, when people complain that their renders are slow, like, and Vlado and I do have similar things, like 99% of the time, all we do is remove all of their settings and start back with the defaults, and it solves everything, almost everything. Sometimes their renders will go up 5 times faster just by going back to defaults. And I think that there's this philosophy that if I don't use the defaults, like, then I'm actually doing something.
Yes. So, I mean, this is an interesting topic, what with AI and everything. It's a question of sometimes people just need to feel like they weren't cheating. As if I use the default, I'm just cheating.
Yeah.
You're not. You're taking advantage of a tool in your arsenal. But sometimes there was a need to feel like, well, if I'm a true 3D artist, I would have tweaked maximum sample intensity. I would have been in there, and it's not necessarily true.
Right.
But I do think there's a belief that, if you bring in an asset from Cosmos, you should edit the material or you're cheating, And, I think we need to lose that mindset. If anybody's stuck thinking that way, you take every advantage you can get, and why not?
Right. Absolutely. So I have a story, and it's similar. You can understand when I was actually I was working at DD. I was working on the movie Oblivion, and we had to do a digi-double for Tom Cruise because there's a certain situation. I think I've told this story before, but this would be maybe a good for some of you haven't heard it. But we did a very, very, very precise scan of Tom, right? And so we had this done at ICT, and we had incredible data. Fabulous geometry, obviously, as you can imagine, everything. But then we also had really, really solid, perfectly calibrated texture maps, right? We had diffuse maps, specular maps, bump maps, all that stuff is really good. And getting a perfect digital human render now is actually better for some reason. But back then, it was always a little bit like, and people could not just sort of nail the look really perfectly. And so I did something where I basically said, I was a supervisor at the time, and I usually handed off the work to someone else. And I was like, this is the digi-double stuff. It's important, but it's not. I'm going to try to see what I can do on my own as a supervisor, and then hand off what I have to someone else. And I did some renders of Tom, and I showed it off, and they're like, "Oh my God, that's amazing! What did you do? He looks perfect." And I said, "You know what I did?" And they said, "What?" And I said, "I did nothing. I used default shaders, and I plugged into texture maps and make sure everything was the correct color space, and just hit render, and it looked perfect." And I was like, "How's that possible?" It's like, because that's how math works. It's 2.2 equals 4, not 2.1 and 1.9, because you tweak 2 little things that you have to make it equals 4 again. You just start with the defaults and you should be fine. And I think that people sort of forget that, like something's calibrated, just go with it, right? If we create materials in Cosmos, we created those with calibration in mind, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And if you just use it as is, to me that's a godsend. It means you can go on and do something else. It's one less thing for you to tweak and worry about. Don't feel you have to tweak everything. Just where you don't need to tweak it and it looks good, move on.
Right.
Be grateful.
Right. And if you want to make a different furniture, then make different furniture. But it's available for you to do that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very interesting to sort of think about like what default is and if it's okay to use default. And I think a lot of the reason that people are afraid of that at some point. It's like, oh no, I have to tweak everything. Every little detail. I mean, do you think there's a time where we should just remove variables for people not to mess with them?
Yes. We've done that in Corona to some degree. There are some things that you just can't access. There are some things you can, but we kind of hide them. And there are some things we've just totally removed.
Right.
And, nobody can get access unless you go and rewrite the code. So yeah, I do think there's a point in time where it can do more harm than good by letting users have functionality.
Right.
Just because at the very least it will tempt them to try it. And then they'll, at the worst case scenario, one of the best cases, they just lose some time messing with something they didn't need to touch. And the worst cases, they break something and make it look worse. But I do think, I think it's fine to remove some things and keep them hidden. And I think it's fine from the user's point of view. They could be grateful too.
Right. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about Corona today. Obviously, like you said, it's been 7 years since the merger. Corona has been around for what, almost 10 years more, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So let's talk a little bit about what Corona, where Corona is today, and how it's changed. Like, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen most recently that happened in Corona that has really sort of affected things?
Well, this year, I'd say, and obviously it's a choice, and choice I have made, that based on where we are with Chaos as a whole, I've really wanted Corona to integrate better with other Chaos products. So a prime example is Vantage. For a long time, more than I care to remember, people have been saying, will you make a GPU Corona? And we've said, no. It's an awful lot of work. People don't realize it's not just a press a button to recompile it. You have to actually rewrite things because the hardware is so different. The way you approach solving a problem has to change. And so that was never on the table. But here's a wonderful product we have, Vantage, GPU-based render engine. If we can just get your Corona scene over to that, then you have a GPU rendering option. So that's one thing we're working on for 12. I don't envisage a live link like we have with V-Ray. It will be more of just a one-way send it over to Vantage and make use of it. But I think that's a good starting point, and we'll see where we go. But yeah, we have these tools out there in the Chaos ecosystem, and I'd like to take advantage of it. And here you are, you have a way of getting GPU rendering without us having to spend 2 years rewriting the Corona render engine, which would be very pointless. Right. But hopefully it gives users what they need. And we're looking into other aspects of that as well. There are so many tools now in Chaos with our recent acquisitions and similar. The company has grown significantly. And I do want to make sure that Corona works well alongside all these other tools. That gives our users equal footing, whether you use V-Ray or Corona or Enscape. You'll start to have access to all of these things from Chaos. Kind of the same if you're in Adobe and you're using Photoshop or After Effects. There is some way to get between those products.
Sure.
Functional manner. So that's my focus for this year. But I think that's fine. Users have been asking for Vantage for a while, since at least a year and a half ago. So we are giving them what they need, as well as I think serving what Chaos needs to be about these days. We're not just a bunch of products that all exist in their own little silos.
Right.
It is products that work together to get you where you want to go.
I mean, it's true. We actually, if you think about it, we have a ton of renderers over at Chaos, right? We have Corona, we have V-Ray GPU, which is different than V-Ray CPU, and we have Vantage, which is different than all of those, and we have Enscape, and we have Corona, and those are all different ways of approaching it. They're all similar in some ways, but they all sell something, they all solve it from a different point of view or different solution.
Exactly.
And they kind of need to exist and on their own things to solve these different problems. But interoperability of these things is kind of an interesting part of it, right? Vantage, I think, is one of the most interesting. To me, that's that's because of the way I see things. Vantage is one of the most exciting products we've had in a long time because of how it's approaching things. It doesn't solve the same things that V-Ray or Corona or Enscape does, but it does approach something in an interesting. And to me, I see a lot of future in real-time ray tracing and how that works. But solving that problem of like, okay, I'm not going to necessarily rewrite a new renderer for Corona, but I have to make Corona understand Vantage, which means that essentially you're going to have to get your data to translate into a new way so that Vantage can work on it. What are your thoughts on how to think of standards for interoperability with things?
This is an interesting one, and it's always a challenge. We are going this time around, for example, to show you how much of a challenge it is, there are several ways we could approach this. There's USD, or there's our internal format that we have, the VR scene. And we have opted to go with VR scene in this case. Because it's quicker and easier. There are some parts of this bridge from Corona to Vantage already exist due to one of the new upcoming tools that was revealed in the unboxed, the storytelling tool.
Sure.
And because of that, it actually has some code that exists that basically takes a Corona standalone and convert it into a VR scene, which is exactly what Vantage
needs,
ingests. So it made sense to go that way. But it is a complicated question because you're left with, USD is more broad in general. And I don't think we've fully, I say we, I don't mean Chaos, the industry as a whole, I don't think really has come to terms with a standard. Maybe we never will because there isn't really one that would do everything for everybody. Because there's been several standards brought forward over the last 10, 20 years, and none of them have ever stuck. But it is a shame that there isn't something that at least smooths the way. If it's like 80% correct and the last 20 you have to do manually, that's still better than I'm stuck in one product and can't get to another.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting problem because obviously interoperability is been an issue for nearly any application that uses 3D data, right? Mm-hmm. Be it from architecture to architecture visualization to VFX to anything, automotive, right? They're all trying to get their CAD data in there. They're all trying to get whatever they're trying to do is trying to figure out how to take this data and make it usable in another format, just even the act of people trying to get things in Unreal. There's entire departments, very, very expensive department just to make sure it can work in Unreal. And they're like, oh, look how great it is. Yeah, but how much effort did it take you to get there, right? And so USD is an interesting thing for me because I've been thinking, how have we managed this for so long? What has been our stopgap? And what was weird, and maybe I'm wrong, but in order to get something into your data, you had the FBX was one of the biggest formats that people used, right? But FBX was written by Filmbox specifically for, mocap data, right? And so how we've been shoehorning, everyone across the industry have been shoehorning this FBX formats, which is a means of translating mocap data from one platform to another. And it's just it's amazing that we still use it to this day. And so that's, sort of the birth of USD. Now, what's also interesting, if you think about it, USD has been this format that honestly, from the visual effects point of view, it's almost like everyone wants to move to this format. They're all into it. But I'm wondering about the archviz and the architecture community. Have they thought of this as the right tool or not? What's their philosophy there?
We only have a few people who've asked for USD, so it's not in general use, and we don't really have anything on the plan certainly not for this year for USD from Corona because it is primarily a VFX format. As it matures, it may well find, because it's still maturing. There's the OpenUSD Alliance, which we're part of. People are still working out how it should look and how it should work. It maybe we revisit it. It may become more useful for archviz people. But right now, what we see is people really wanting to get to Vantage, and our internal format is a better fit, and we don't have so many people asking for USD. They are out there, and we are listening, but now is not the time. And ask me again in 12 months, and we'll see if I've changed my mind.
Yeah, I'm curious because I think everyone needs to be open to a way for us to translate that. And if you really look at it, really look at our standalone format of VRC files and USD, there's actually not. They're pretty close in terms of their syntax and how they think of things. So that's kind of also an interesting idea as well. And what about materials? Like materials are obviously that's another big philosophy. How does Corona approach materials that's different from other renderers in some ways?
Every engine it's amazing how there is no standard for materials. Every engine has its own approach that it's usually 90% similar, but that last 10% will kill you. If you want to read a material from one engine, most of those parameters will match up one to one, but not all of them, and those last ones will be a guess, as to how you're supposed to handle it. It is a huge challenge. We have a challenge converting from V-Ray, for example, or 3ds Max native or C4D native, because we've chosen to go with a metallic, non-metallic as a switch for the material. And there's a question of deciding when should Corona go, oh, okay, I'm importing this material and it's a metal. When we first started, it got that wrong almost all the time. Just about anything was turning into metal. Your grass was made out of metal. It was actually quite hard to solve, and we've fine-tuned it a little bit, but there are still some cases where technically the IOR is set wrong in the material we're reading. It's too high. An IOR of that level really would be a metal if there was anything, but it's been set on a grass blade. So, there's the question of how can we tell? The IOR indicates it's a metal, but how are we smart enough to go, but this is a grass blade or a leaf? They really didn't mean that. It's just the way the other engine works.
Yeah.
How do we get smart enough to do that? It's an ongoing challenge.
Well, first of all, I think for the philosophy of you making metal a 1 or a 0 is the right way to go. I think the biggest misnomer is the word metalness that implies that there's something between 1 and 0.
Which there isn't. Not in the real world. It's either
not in the real world.
And they act differently. The way they respond to light is in fact very different. And of course, every render engine is a compromise. We take shortcuts in figuring out how the light interacts with the surface. Otherwise, you would be there forever waiting for your render. But there are different ways of compromising, and some of them allow things like, as you say, 0.5 metal. It's half not metal and half not metal. That just
half plastic and half metal does not exist, right? No.
Yeah, does not exist. Right. But a lot of render engines will let you create it.
They will. And I think that people, when people are drawing texture maps, they do draw a lot of 0.5s in those texture maps, right?
Yes.
The only reason I feel that you need to have a 0.5 is to make sure you have an anti-aliased edged, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So this is the approach of the Corona material, because we redid it. I think it was 3 years ago now. We reworked our material. To found it purely on physically realistic principles. So we don't allow these half plastic, half metals, which goes, as I say, as a problem. Right. Because when we get one and we want to convert it to Corona, which one which one is it?
Yeah.
Which
Oh,
one
I was
should we use?
horribly guilty of that, by the way. I used to.
Oh, me too.
When I would base it before metalness or any idea of creating metal versus dielectric materials and all that stuff, before doing any of that stuff, I would actually, it's like I'm going to put the IRR at 7. Like nothing is that high.
Exactly. Yeah, but it worked. It looked okay in your scene. So yeah, I'm the same. And the same with reflectivity. Like for metal, you should really just adjust the IOR. There is no such thing as a reflection amount that you adjust.
Right.
But I was doing that all the time. And the old Corona material, if you see, we come back now to talking about whether you enable users to do it or whether it's all right to take some things away. And sometimes it's better to take things away, because if you're given them the opportunity, like I was given the opportunity, I created all sorts of materials that were not physically realistic.
Yep. Yeah, technically, they should. A specular map should be just pure white all the time. But it's a little hard to tweak things with a value that's an IOR that's variable, right? That's really hard.
Yeah. So it's a challenge. So this is always the challenge with conversion, and it exists when we're going from Corona to VR scene, because obviously the materials that have to be ready for V-Ray to understand. And it's equally a challenge when we're coming from anything else into Corona. It's an ongoing challenge. It'll be a challenge if we start doing a USD format as well. But I think it's a challenge we all face. If anybody involved in a random engine has to face this.
Yeah, I think it's really kind of interesting. Going back to the users that I always get along with really well are the ones that just don't worry too much about that stuff. They don't get too bogged down by it. They're just like, I just use it, and then I don't think about it, and it just looks great. Right?
Yeah. And that is valid. If it looks fine, who cares if it's technically accurate? It looks
sure.
Sometimes it can, and it's like albedo is a prime example. If your albedo is too high, you can slow down the render engine because you're bouncing more light off a surface than is physically possible to bounce off that surface, and that can slow down the GI. So on the one hand, it can have a negative impact. On the other, if it looks fine and you don't really care that it's making things slower, I really can say you shouldn't do it. There's no right or wrong in that regard.
Right. I mean, I think the best example I can think of your philosophy of just make it look good and don't worry too much about it is the way that Corona dealt with caustics, right? For caustics for so long was such a complicated and tweaky way of approaching a light problem, which is critical. Everyone needs to include caustics in some way. In fact, everything around us involved caustics.
Yes.
But in Corona's approach was like, we'll take care of it.
Yeah. It's still not as tweak-free as we'd like.
Yes.
I do want to revisit that. And we get users asking.
Yeah, but think about the old days when we dealt with manually putting in photon maps, and resolution of photon maps is horrible.
Yeah, and the result was always terrible and really slow. Took a long time before you realized your settings were wrong. That was the real problem. You had to wait an hour and then go, oh no, the settings aren't right. I must go back and try again with different settings. And we have done away with that. We're talking about more a level of refinement now that people want to achieve. And I'd like to get there too. I don't know how much room there is for improvement in terms of the code and the magic that our light transport people understand, and I don't. Hoping there's room for improvement, and we can find some way to tweak it to make it even better than it currently is. So it is a standout feature of Corona, but I think there's still wiggle room, and I want to cycle back into it probably 2025, because 24 I'm very focused on the ecosystem. But 25, I think I'd like to revisit caustics first and foremost.
Oh, interesting. Okay. But
it's a key thing that separates Corona from other render engines, and I think it's about time we came back to it and had a look and see if there's anything else we can do.
And have you found users that are like, oh my God, I wish I could get Corona stuff into Vantage and see how that works? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, lots. In fact, of course, it was happening where Vantage was free. People were like, we want to go from Corona to Vantage. And it was quite a large number of people. And then, of course, Vantage now costs a separate subscription.
Well, it's gotten a lot more complicated since the early days.
Exactly, it's matured. I mean, it was kind of an early test version
Sure.
that was free, and now it's mature. It's a product like anything
Right.
else. So I revisited all the people on the forums because they were still going, "We want Vantage." And I was like, "Okay, you're telling me this, but I do want to understand you're saying this, and you know it's an extra subscription.
Right.
It's not a free thing anymore. So if we make it available, you will have to." Subscribe to Vantage to be able to take advantage.
Right.
Are you still keen and enthusiastic? We want Vantage. We want
Right.
Vantage. And it comes up every time there's any sort of video. If we release a tutorial, it came up at the Unboxed event, the comments in the chat. When Corona and Vantage. So it's extremely in demand. And as I say, I wanted to check because Corona users are quite price sensitive. Compared to, I would say compared to V-Ray users, but...
They're quite what? I'm sorry,
so
I missed
I was
that last
like,
word.
Price sensitive.
Oh, price sensitive, right.
And, having to pay for Vantage on top, just because it's a separate product, I wasn't sure if that would change their mind. Were they under the illusion that this would be totally free? But no, it turns out they're super excited about Vantage because that's how good a product it is.
Right.
And they do want to get from Corona into there. So hopefully within, where are we? March, April, May, June. Hopefully within 3 months.
Well, let's get a little bit more into interoperability. I think obviously this is something that we've been discussing as part of the company. We have, like I said, many different solutions, and they all kind of need to have to find a way to operate together. Corona and V-Ray and Enscape and all of those products need to sort of figure out how they can exchange data so that our users have the right place to go. Now, you mentioned that USD is something that, it's a little bit challenging. How else can we look at interoperability for these products that sort of makes it, similar to the settings, right? How do we make it so that it's as seamless as possible for our users to do that?
Yeah, I mean, we could enhance what we have in-house. The things like VRC are certainly workable. I believe that's what they use for the Enscape V-Ray bridge. I'll be honest, I haven't dug too much.
Use the VRC stuff?
I haven't dug too much into that. I'm aware it's there, but I haven't really looked into how it works yet. But I believe that's, again, VRC. I'd be reluctant to do anything these days other than either VRC or USD. Those are the two. We have our own internal standard that works pretty well and we have full control over. We have USD that's developing and growing and lets us branch out outside the company too. And I think those are the two valid ways to look at interconnecting any product. And you can always start with one and move to the other over time. We're not necessarily locked into just the one. But for Corona right now, VRC are a focus. Stage A, that's what I was mentioning is we should have the Vantage in 3 months because Corona 12 is out in June.
Wow.
And that's when we hope to be able to send from Corona to Vantage. And then at the end of the year, because we'll have another Corona, we always do 2 a year, we should be able to come from Enscape to Corona if you want to, again through the VR scene. We'll basically be able to read in VR scene. Technically means you could be coming from V-Ray or Vantage or Enscape. You should be able to then bring those scenes into Corona, should you choose.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, creating those pipes are kind of the foundation, right? And then what goes through those pipes can change, obviously, if we need to use VRC or switch over to USD. It's kind of a different way of doing it. But that's really, really interesting and exciting because then the Corona users will have easy access to GPU rendering, right?
Yes. And I personally, I love playing with Vantage. I'm always amazed at the speed and the quality. It's and I'm on a laptop, so I mean, I can imagine what it would be like on a desktop. Okay, it's got a 4080 in it, but it's still a laptop, which is not the same as a desktop 4080. And I can get great speed out of it and great visual quality. And I'm always amazed because I try and break it by grabbing a fairly complicated scene, lots of scatters and stuff, and it's got grass blades all over the place, and Vantage just handles it, and I'm just like, whoa, this is so cool.
Well, I think that's really interesting. Vantage obviously is built similar, right? Philosophically speaking, the way that Corona was built philosophically on making it as quality as possible for a specific task of global illumination, et cetera, for our users. Vantage was everything for real time, right? As much speed as for real time. But because it's ray tracing, the concept of complexity is different than you think it is, right? Complexity, we think of just a ton of geometry, but that's actually not a complicated problem for a pure ray tracer. More complicated problem is, how do I scatter light inside of a subsurface scattering skin, right? That's a more complicated problem. Or a really complex shader algorithm can be a little bit more complicated. But for 99% of archviz, like a straight up shading where you have the proper diffuse and the metallic levels and all that stuff, that should just be pretty straightforward, right?
It should, yeah. And it's just great. It gives users another option to either create a draft if you're just wanting to see how something looks like quickly. Obviously, GPU
and cameras. You can get really good cameras. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, maybe in some cases finals, because not everybody is selling an $18 million apartment, and there are cases where maybe you don't need the full quality of a Corona offline render, and a GPU render with level of quality that something like Vantage has is good enough. And now you have an option, and that's what I like, options.
Right, exactly. Well, listen, Tom, it's been awesome talking to you. Obviously, like I said, it's been a long time in the making to get you on and get you available. And I think we should definitely have you on more as new features come on board or things are happening in the Corona world. So let us know. It's like, hey, you and I chat online, obviously, because we're both part of the same company. We deal with a lot of stuff. But it's like, you know what? Hey, we should have a refresher. There's something new happening. So when Vantage comes on board and tell us what that journey was like, that would be really cool to hear that process.
And it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, this is the CG show to rule them all and in the darkness find them. There's nothing.
It's
else
been around
like
for a while, but I don't know if it's the one to rule them all. But it has been fun to have this on.
Yeah, so it's been an honor to be on here. And yes, we'll make sure it doesn't take so long again next time. I'll be back to quote another movie.
Perfect. Thank you.